the great privilege of meeting Dr. Speridiao Faissol from Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. He is working primarily with the Institute of Geography and Statistics for the Brazilian government, but he is also Vice President of the International Geographical Union. He's here to tell us about the plans for next year's IGU Congress in Brazil. So I have cornered him for a moment to speak a little bit about his own research interests, which are close to mine: urban and regional development. He will tell us specifically about the dream and reality of development planning with a focus on the 70s, hopefully. But first, I would like you to tell us a little bit about your own personal background, where you come from, and where your interest in geography and regional development have sprung. Can you just...
Yes, thank you. It's a great opportunity for me to be here and to talk with you and to so many other people that would listen to this program. I am a Brazilian geographer. I was born in the state of Minaes Geraesm, which is a central state, central western state. My father was a farmer. I was born in a small village. So since my childhood, I learned to observe the landscape, to appreciate the landscape and have a feeling for how it looks like, what are the difference between one place and another. So I suppose a born interest in geography came in from this background. And it's interesting to see that even though now I am a urban regional geographer working and interested in the problems of the growth of towns and the planning of development of these towns, this rural background led me to have my PhD program in my dissertation on rural development in Brazil. So it was since my PhD, which was here in the United States in Syracuse, that sometime after that I turned into urban and regional programs. So that rural background, I think, led me to rural problems in Brazil, especially in my own area, in central western Brazil. Of course, being from a small town in the interior of Brazil, to have my college courses, I moved into Rio to go to the university. And of course, my interest at that time was, just to get a degree in geography and see whether I would either teach geography or going into research. To help my going into school, I became a part-time worker in the Brazilian Institute of Geography and Statistics, which did that for a number of students to help them get through the university, but not only to get through the university, but also to start some training while studying in practical problems, in theoretical problems, in living with geographical problems of any kind. And of course, after 3 years in the university and in that institute, I had finished my undergraduate course and became an employee of that institute.
Which years would this have been?
This was 1941-42, and by 1944 I was already a graduate from the university, employee of this institute. Of course, this institute, it's a unique, to some extent, a unique organization in the sense that it is a part of the Ministry of Planning, but it has a extensive research and development program and a group. And it's quite interdisciplinary in the sense that it has geography and demography and economists and sociology and anthropologists and so on in that research and development group. The purpose of this research and development group, it's not only to produce research and studies for the Ministry of Planning, but also to feed back the statistical agency. This institute is also the central statistical agency of Brazil. So the research and development group feeds back, and it's feeded by this data that we collect, and it feeds back the people that organize the questionnaires and so on. So research we do points out some of the critical problems for which we need more data to understand it better. So that's what I call a unique system, which is not very common in most places. So I begin that work on research, geography associated with other social sciences in Brazil, in this institute, up to 1952. At that time, Professor Preston James from Syracuse University was in Brazil, and I worked with him in Brazil at that time, just the year before. And he suggested, and he actually offered a fellowship for me to come to Syracuse to complete my graduate work, which I did for about 3 years, working with him in Syracuse. And finally I got my PhD in Syracuse. And as I mentioned before, at that time, my dissertation was on the problems of agricultural development of the Central Plateau in Brazil. It was that because at that time we were engaged in this institute I just mentioned, we were engaged in extensive surveys, analysis, and studies for the location of the new capital of Brazil.
Yes, that's one of the most renowned dream and reality projects.
Yes, as a matter of fact, the dream of the new capital began with the positivists that were basically responsible for at least for the intellectually conceived part of the proclaiming the Republic in Brazil. And their dream at that time was that if the capital of Brazil, instead of being in Rio de Janeiro, would be located on the center of the country. And I almost quote, they said, the water from the rivers, as the ideas would flow from that center of the country into all directions, because their idea of that center was not exactly the geometrical center of the country, but some place in which most of the river basins would sort of start from that point. So the idea was that the geometric position would also be relevant to the political idea of having a capital, ideas and facts and laws and so on, dispersing from that main center like the waters on the river, which is a dream, at least.
Well, something Foucault has some comments on.
Yes.
So the work for this already began in the 50s then, yes?
Yes. Then from that time, of course, the idea was left, without any consequences, up to the end of the 40s, when it was decided to some extent that a new site for the capital would be selected, and a new position for the capital would be selected. Now, of course, ideas in geography at that time had at least in Brazil, had evolved from the idea of a center in terms of the geometrical center, but toward the idea of a core of the country. A core with a concept of a more political and economic core rather than simply the geometric center. So since at that time São Paulo state and the southern part of Brazil was already the most developed part of the country, and most of the economic power was already located in the southeast area, which include also, of course, Rio de Janeiro. Rather than being too far to the northwest in the direction of the wild frontier or something, it should be projected into this area, but it should be located within the core, or at least in the margin of that core. So these were the basic ideas orienting people that were studying and trying to produce a report that could lead to a decision into where to place the capital. And my dissertation was connected with that problem, because even though that center, that margin of the core was near the central area, that central area in Brazil was basically savanna type of vegetation and soils. And it's known that these soils are poor. So the supply, the food supply, or the agricultural in general supply area for this new capital should be located and should be studied in its capacity to really supply things for that. And my dissertation then was associated with the idea of understanding in this part of the central plateau of Brazil, where we would have soils, topography, local conditions in general, climate, and so on, to serve as the basic
food source,
food supply area for the new capital. And so I was in charge, one of the persons in charge of the problem of studying one of the areas. And it's interesting now, I think, to mention that at that time we had a German geographer in Brazil, Professor Leo Weibel.
In the 50s?
Yes, in the end of the 40s and the beginning of the 50s. And he came from the United States. I think he was in Minnesota. And he came to Brazil to begin to study, basically to begin to study the problem of German colonization in the south of Brazil. But since he was a Fontinen man, he had written several papers on that. He was also interested to see how the different areas in Brazil, how the Fontinen pattern could be observed, and in what way it could help in the programming new developments in agriculture. And I was, again, one of the persons that was working with him for some time in that project. And it was interesting because he said at the time that he wanted to begin into the backlands because he wanted to see on one side the vegetation as natural as possible without much of human intervention. And since he had a long experience in Africa, he wanted to see the savanna type of vegetation and see in what way that savanna type could be utilized in something different than the simple extensive grazing that was always used before. So we began some field work in that area, which was not far from the area that most people would thought that the new capital would be located. So I began that agriculture study with Professor Weibel at that time in this area that it would serve as the basic food supply area for the new capital. So when I came to the United States, I had that study nearly completed. So my PhD program in the United States was quite curious. The first thing I had done was the dissertation. Then I began to take the courses and the final program. So it's if one look at my courses and my program in in Syracuse at that time, 3 months after my oral examination, I had my dissertation written.
Oh my goodness!
So it was a quite
unusual. Well, you know,
unusual.
Preston James himself has said that the reason he preferred to go to Clark rather than Chicago in the early 20s was that at Clark he could write his own program.
Yes.
So he obviously believed in letting people write their own
Yes.
graduate program.
Of course, I owe much of my experience to these two persons, but in the United States, Professor Preston James, who became, I think I could call him my intellectual father of some kind, because after that, after the PhD program, we worked for a long time together in corresponding and exchanging experience and so on. So, and of course, his experience in Latin America, his view of the problems of Brazil to some extent, and to many other countries in Latin America as well, I think it helped to strengthen my graduate training and my understanding of the problems a lot, and helped me in many other situations.
One was very curious about such things. Would now Professor James' textbook on Latin America be used widely in Latin America or not?
Well, the problem in Latin America is that students would not speak English very commonly. Since his book has not been translated into Spanish, it's somewhat difficult to use his books.
Yes.
And his book is also, I think, better for upper level of undergraduate and probably for some of the graduate courses as well. Yes. And you know, and now in Latin America, you don't have so many graduate courses as you understand them in the United States. Yes. In some cases, you have master's programs, but the PhD programs, there are not very many. Even in Brazil, you have one PhD program in São Paulo State for geography. In Rio itself, you have a master's program, and you don't have a PhD program. So that type of book, sometimes it's more useful if we had some graduate program.
But your whole background in Brazil has been strongly influenced from France, right? French geographers.
In Brazil, yes, at least up to World War I, World War II. I'm sorry.
Yes.
But after World War II, quite a number of Brazilian students and geographers were turning to non-France Western Europe. Into the United States. Even though I had in my undergraduate program many French geographers, professors, like Professor Pierre Monbeg or Professor Rouelin or many others. They had great influence in forming Brazilian geographers before that time. I had come to the United States for a PhD program, and some other my colleagues were also. I think 2 of our doctors in Brazil were from Louisiana State
really?
Here.
So this cultural landscape tradition is also kept alive in Brazilian geography.
Yes, it was kept alive quite strongly, as a matter of fact.
Yes.
Now, then after I came back from the States, and this was already 1956 and 1957, the selection of the new capital was already decided, and the problem was then to really begin the planning of the new town. And of course, even though the selection of the position of the new capital, geographers had a very important role to play in the planning of the town itself. We had basically architects, and I think it's well known that the overall plan was done by Lúcio Costa, and most of the city planning was done by I forgot his name.
Was it a Frenchman?
No.
No.
Well, I'll remember the name in a minute. But he also planned the building of the United Nations. It's a well-known Brazilian architect.
We both bow our heads in shame for having forgotten. Well, such happens. But did the
Niemeyer?
Yes, Niemeyer.
Oscar Niemeyer.
Yes, all right. But did the internal plan reflect that general ideology of a core, or was it?
No, because Oscar Niemeyer was a materialist, Marxist thinker, and so his whole planning of the town reflected the idea of small communities within the town, somewhat self-sufficient in terms of local things and schools and so on. But one of the most curious thing about that, and that's why I mentioned he was Marxist. He is Marxist. Is that his major accomplishment in terms of the architectural organization of the town was the Catholic Church, which is difficult to understand that someone of that line. And well, the picture is a well-known, the picture of the cathedral in Brazilia is well-known, and it symbolized someone on his knees. Because it has a shape like that, someone on his knees. And it's interesting to note that you have sort of a tunnel before entering the church itself. And his own explanation for that is that the tunnel is somewhat dark, and religion is the light after you had passed the dark. And this, for a convicted Marxist, is something that it's difficult to understand.
Oh, I think most creative thinkers know where things
have
fit.
No,
they recognize where, but it sounds a bit more anarchist than Marxist, this idea of having cohesive communities. But was it adequately planned for economic development, or was it simply going to be a kind of residence for the government?
No, it was basically thought as a governmental place for the workers, for the government, and so on. But of course, he has to have all the services and so on. It wasn't thought to be of any industrial development in this area, but all of the other service at the level of needed by a capital city of a country of the size of Brazil, with now 120 million people. But this was the dream. They thought that the new capital would grow up to 500,000 people in the year of 2000. That is, in 40 years, it would grow from nothing to 500,000 people. Now we are in 1980, and the census that was done in Brazil in September 1970 showed that Brasilia had 1.3 million people at that time. So they had passed the 500,000 mark by far. 20 years before the time limit that they thought that they would get.
How does one explain it? Is it migration, attraction of the capital, or has there really been economic?
Yes, you have to think the effect that the capital city has on people. People would tend to go to the capital city because, it's near the government, a lot of things in there, people would tend to go there. And plus the fact that, to serve as the capital city, one needed to build roads into it. And of course, roads from Brasilia to north up to Belém, where is the mouth of the Amazon, to the south, to São Paulo, to the northeast, and to the southwest, into the Bolivian and Paraguayan border. Now, these roads, of course, serve to increase the accessibility of Brasilia for many things.
They're generators.
Including for migrants.
Yes.
And of course, since the dream was reflected in the reality of the size of the town as planned.
Yes.
The town was planned to hold 500,000 people in 20 years, in 30 years. And the physical setting of that town in 1980 wouldn't support this 1.3 million. So where did they go? They had gone to the vicinity, to the surroundings of the town itself. And of course, there you had just bare land. You had no planned town like Brasilia with no traffic signs, for instance, and a lot of modern, so-called modern means of crossing underneath or on top and so on to make traffic very easy. So since it didn't resist so many people migrating into that, they had to build without any planning, just begin to build a street and houses on both sides and so on. So now you have a number of 100,000 people, towns, in the surroundings, 3 or 4 of them in the surroundings of Brasilia, which changed the whole picture of the organization of the town itself. Now, it had followed the pattern traditionally in many other places in Brazil. Someone would buy some land and divide it into pieces, build some streets and so on, and there you have people moving into it. So it followed the old traditional pattern of establishing new towns in Brazil. So you have the well-planned Brasilia core, and then the
pot that boiled out.
And spilled over into the surroundings.
Is the government deliberately trying to contain that in any way, or mop it up?
During the 60s and the 70s, a lot of studies on migration behavior were conducted in Brazil to see, how it worked. They deliberately tried not to offer special conditions for industries or for any economic activity to be located in Brasilia. But people began to move, and there was nothing you can do, because you can't prohibit someone to move to anywhere in the country. It would be impossible to control. And once they migrated into Brasilia, the emergence of services and commerce and supermarkets and all kinds, and schools and hospitals and everything, for servicing that population would be unavoidable as well. So, right now, I think the position that everybody takes in relation to that problem is let it go. There's nothing we can do about, so let it go.
But it's not the only part of Brazil where population is increasing at this rate and urbanizing itself.
No.
But in other areas, you can explain it more, I suppose, in terms of economic incentive. But here, it's simply the attraction of the capital, it seems.
Yes, it is the attraction. Well, and it's the attraction of the interior. A lot of the dispute and the arguments about Brasilia was that we had about 90% of the Brazilian population in a 400 kilometers belt from the coast. And a lot of people said that, well, if we are ever to be a big country in addition to being a large country, we have to move more into the interior. We have to occupy the remote areas of the country, we have to transform the political boundaries into economic boundaries as well. That's the dream again. And of course, in some places, that dream is being transformed into reality. But in most of the Brazilian frontier, except for the Argentina border and a little bit here and there, most of the frontier is an empty frontier with places along the frontier, but not with a overall occupants of the territory.
What do you draw from that? What the story, as you've told it, suggests to me that decentralization inland will work if political power goes with it, but not otherwise. Is that being too wild?
But it didn't quite work because, well, if we look what happened in these areas, you have Brasilia with almost 1.5 million. You have a new state that was created in the Bolivian border toward the northwest, which is the state of Rondônia. They found minerals there, and the soils of the forest was very good. So we have a very strong migration into this area. So much that, for instance, that area as a federal territory had about 50,000 people in 1960. It grew to 150 in 1970 and to 500,000 in 1980. So it was a tremendous population growth during these 20 years in which they had moved into there because of good land, of some minerals they found in there. So it was quite an extensive. But most of the rest of the area, except for that part of Rondônia, was left with one inhabitant for 50 or 100 square kilometers. So it's really empty land. But even there, it's a small number of people. Now, if you take São Paulo, for instance, the large metropolitan area in São Paulo, which in 1970 had about 8 million people. In 1980 has about 12 million. So it's a 50% increase for the metropolitan area as a whole. But you take small or medium-sized towns in the interior of that area. Some of them had doubled, some of them had tripled population in the 10 years. So that overall growth of the metropolitan area follows the same traditional pattern in most large metropolitan areas of the world, in which the population of the main town, it's not growing very rapidly anymore because the densities are very high and population is sort of spilling over into the surroundings, into the area around that major center, and they're growing very rapidly. So 4 million people had moved and born in São Paulo metropolitan area in the last 10 years. Now, I'm mentioning this because in the late 60s, 67, 68, we were conscious that the 8 or 9 large metropolitan centers in Brazil were overgrowing. And then something had to be done to control the growth, or at least to systematize the growth of these main centers, and to create a policy that would divert migration toward these major centers into some others of smaller size. It was a policy called in Brazil middle-sized towns policy. We thought that if some incentives, some planning toward these centers would work, the growth of these metropolitan centers would be at least slowed down a bit, and these others would grow a little more. And what happened in the 70s was that these these medium-sized centers, they had grown a lot. But the metropolitan centers had grown even more. And and this was was decreasing population in the smaller size centers. In 1980, for instance, you have we have in Brazil as a whole 4,000 counties. Now 300 of them are concentrating half of the Brazilian population. And they are basically these medium-sized urban agglomerations and the large metropolitan areas. And the other 3,700 counties have the other half of the population, which is a tremendous concentration of people into a small number of places. Now, more than that, for instance, in the São Paulo metropolitan area, we had in 1970 about 39% of the industrial output. That's probably more concentration than you have anywhere in the world in terms of the total industrial output for a small area. It's not for a large area like the northeast of the United States or something like that. Again, associated with that urban policy of trying to deconcentrate population, it was a industrial decentralization policy as well.
In secondary manufacturing?
Secondary manufacturing. Okay. And some of the basic things were offered for them was that if they would sell the land and the property they had in the large metropolitan area, they will make naturally a substantial profit in selling the property. And of course, naturally, this profit would be taxed. Now, if one would use that money to reinvest in a new plant outside of the metropolitan area, to modernize the plant and to reinvest outside of the metropolitan area, they will not pay taxes. So this is a very strong incentive to let them move, but apparently not enough, because in 1980 you had 42% of the industrial output in the São Paulo metropolitan area. It was not a large increase from 39 to 42, but even though it was thought to be a decrease, and we ended up by having another increase in the total output. So the concentration of wealth and of people it's very, very large. It's a great concentration in São Paulo. And to some extent, that is true for Rio as well. That is true for some of the other metropolitan in Rio Grande do Sul or on the northeast, or even in the Belém, which is in the mouth of the Amazon. Belém had grown from 600,000 population in 1970 to a little over 1 million in 1980. So there again you have people moving into Belém from the interior of the region. And what is happening in the interior of these regions? Of course, migration proceeds in a stepwise mechanism. And of course, one end of the stepwise process is the metropolitan area. The other end is the rural areas. And for the first time in Brazil, the rural population had decreased in absolute numbers from 1970 to 1980. And that, well, part of the dream was that in the rural areas we should have some means of keeping the population in the rural, to maintain the level of production that was established at one time, and to even increase that production through modernization of the agriculture. So modernization of the agriculture was thought to be not one process to decrease the population, but it was just to increase production, agricultural production. But it turned out to be just decreasing the population, because People would tend to move to lower size, small size, from small size to medium size, and from medium size to the large metropolitan centers. And they are all growing on a 50% a year basis, on a 3.3 yearly basis, while Brazil as a whole was growing 2.4 a year. So with these two figures, you can see that the disparities in growth.
Yes.
And of course, the disparities in growth in the economic side was even higher than that.
Yes. Yes. Well, it seems you have at a macro scale the big problems that most countries have experienced, different micro scales in the post-war period. As the last question, I'd like to ask you if you have any possible dreams for the future now that we have learned so much since the 50s, using what I would consider to be fairly conventional geographic certainties about what is rational in the organization of the landscape. Maybe we've been misguided by picking out models that may work for Central Europe and trying them out in Brazilia and so on. What are the kinds of, just very briefly, what are the kinds of alternatives you're playing with?
Well, of course, we have to look at this thing with two views, a short-run view, which is very important as well. We are in a recession period. We were we began in 1980, has been going through 81, 82, and it probably will go in 83 as well. So when you are in a situation like that, it's somewhat more difficult to think in long terms because the present problems are so pressing that the long-term projections are somewhat left. And this is happening in Brazilian planning. 80% of Brazilian planners are thinking and working for next year's problems. And you have left only, I don't know, maybe 10 or 20% of them thinking for the next decade.
But are they attacking the spatial, like they did in the past, or are they thinking more structurally?
These 20% are thinking both on the structural and the space. The 80% are thinking on the conjunctural situation of next year, because at this time, with all crises and so on, in times of recession, and it has been true in Brazil in most occasions, the first policy to be left aside is the regional imbalance policy. The next one would be the urban policy, and then others would follow as well. So in the last 3 years, regional imbalance regional imbalance because equity has been the basic issue in regional policy in Brazil. And now we are more concerned with the efficiency of the economy as a whole than with any problems of equity.
So you're stuck
regardless of the critical problems in terms of social conditions that this abandonment of the equity may result, even in the short term. But efficiency is so much more important in 1 or 2 years that people would take the risk of deteriorating social conditions to maintain the efficiency, to pay debts in a way.
Well, the picture you are painting is just so complex and it seems so urgent. I'm sure there's nobody who will have looked at this without appreciating the immensity of the task you face. I hope that somehow countries can learn a little bit from each other's experiences. If we look like you have on what was the dream and what was the reality. I want to thank you. I'm sorry the time has been so short. I want to thank you ever so much for sharing what you have with us.
Thank you very much. I thank you.